Over the next 5 years, the nation recovered financially, and it was a very prosperous time. Bankers, mortgage brokers, and the real estate community were having its biggest party ever. Money was raining, and greed was out of control, and it was all related to the American dream of owning a home. Housing prices in the US ballooned to record peaks in 2006, but by 2008, the party was over. The housing bubble burst and sent every lender and the stock market into a tailspin. The financial crisis of 2008 was considered by many economists to have been the worst recession since the Great Depression.
Lost 504 points today, the biggest drop since September 11th, 2001, the terrorist attacks. The stock market is now down 21%.
Because we're now down 43%.
What in the world is happening on Wall Street?
2-year note
A lot
yields.
of their customers are freaked out, waiting to see how low the Dow will go. They're focused on the Dow, not so focused on OPEC. Yes, OPEC did cut production.
Company of American Airlines filed for bankruptcy this morning. American lost $868 million the first
A losing streak in the Dow that in percentage terms puts it
Not only have home sales dropped to a 20-year low, housing prices have dropped 14.4% since last year.
Congress will craft emergency financial assistance package for the automakers using some of the $700 billion bailouts.
Bear Stearns today leading the tumble on Wall Street. The stock plunging 45% after the New York Federal Reserve and
Lehman Brothers, a 158-year-old firm, filed for bankruptcy.
could be the biggest bailout in U.S.
Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are critical to turning the corner on housing.
What are you going to do? If Bernanke needs to open the discount window. That's how bad things are out there. Bernanke needs to focus on this.
Where do we start? Cataclysmic, unnerving, unprecedented, pervasive, chaotic, dark.
The dimensions of which were so vast, were so total, so far-reaching. We had never experienced anything like that in the history of recent history of mankind, right?
The financial crisis of 2008 will go down in history as one of the worst recessions in modern day history, pretty much since the Great Depression here in New York and here in the US. And it was a real estate recession. The housing bubble had burst, and with the housing bubble bursting and people across the country being foreclosed on and not paying the bills, it was a banking, calamity.
We were all buying in. I wish I could sit here and tell you that I saw this coming. I had no clue how hard we were going to get hit. And then it happened, and it was as if someone just turned the switch off and everything just froze up.
I think looking at the financial crisis, it was clearly an unthinkable moment that no one thought would happen in the magnitude that it did. But I had a lot of close friends that were at several of the institutions that went out of business. So for that reason, it was a very upsetting, difficult time.
Another one of the country's largest banks has collapsed. Washington Mutual has gone under, seized by the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation on Thursday. The FDIC then turned around and sold WAMU's thrift banking assets to J.P. Morgan Chase for nearly $2 billion.
And because the bank started defaulting, it became a worldwide recession. It was definitely a very, very scary time.
Foreclosure numbers are on the rise, and now even affecting some who pay their bills on time.
Of course, you've seen the headlines, foreclosures up across the country.
That's right. Imagine.
We were building over 900 units of rental housing that was designed by Frank Gehry, that was supposed to break records for achieving the highest rents ever in Lower Manhattan. And we had bought all of the trades out at the highest point in the market, because as you know, the market was exuberant. So we were paying top dollar for concrete, top dollar for curtain wall, top dollar for tile and sheetrock. And so we had a building that was overpriced from a construction point of view and completely unclear whether we could generate the revenue. That was going on in Manhattan. If you cross the Brooklyn Bridge and come to Brooklyn, we were trying to build a $1 billion arena, and Goldman Sachs came to see us and said, we don't believe you could float the bonds necessary to put that building in the ground.
In October of 2008, everything stopped. The phone stopped ringing. CEOs were not calling us back. No one was expanding and no one was consolidating. People just put all of their plans on the back burner and they just stopped.
Wall Street's worst day since 9/11. The Dow plunging more than 500 points. The S&P down almost 5%. The wreckage unprecedented.
We had a sharp sell-off in stocks on Wall Street today.
Lehman bankrupt. AIG on the brink. Merrill under new ownership.
This company is going to be a thing of beauty as we get to the other side of this economic downturn.
The bedrock of America's financial underpinnings rocked to the very core.
By the middle of 2008, things were terrible. And by the beginning of 2009, everybody said to themselves, how are we going to make it through this?
Our stock plummeted from $68 a share. Its low point was $3 a share. We had $500 million of equity in the dirt at Barclays Center in Pacific Park, Brooklyn, and not a single vertical building to show for it. We had no liquidity, and we had high debt and maturing obligations that were approaching us within the next 12 to 18 months. This was a disaster of proportions that this company has never seen.
What's going on in the stock market, and I know that the two of you know this, is a sideshow to a housing and debt problem in this country, whether we're down 400 now or 1,000 now, until we start to not only deal with the banks, which we did to buy some time. Now, Mark and Aaron, you guys know it, we have to deal with the houses. We have to go directly at the houses.
You brought that up.
Yeah. So, for the first time, the federal government of the United States took measures that were unprecedented, and by providing capital to prevent major financial institutions from collapsing totally, right?
The American Recovery and Reinvestment Act that I will sign today, a plan that meets the principles I laid out in January, is the most sweeping economic recovery package in our history. It's the product of broad consultation and the recipient of broad support from business leaders, unions, public interest groups, from the Chamber of Commerce and the National Association of Manufacturers, as well as the AFL-CIO, from Democrats and Republicans, mayors as well as governors. It's a rare thing in Washington for people with such diverse and different viewpoints to come together and support the same bill.
So we did what we always do, which was we band together and we created a war room and we dealt with each and every problem in piecemeal, and believe that if you have a series of small victories, you end up with a great success.
Fortunately, I had gone to all cash before that moment, so it wasn't a financial impact. I look at problems a little differently than most people. When there's a challenge, I actually think that's an opportunity. And so even though there was this unthinkable dark moment in the world, in our financial system, for us, we were studying the markets very specifically then to see what would be our next big move.
That last quarter, the fourth quarter of 2008, I knew that business had to shift and change completely. So for us, we started selling distressed debt. And the way this came about was very, very basic and very simple. There are buildings in Midtown Manhattan that people have bought at the peak of the market and way overpaid. And these are prime corners of Herald Square and prime corners of Times Square and all throughout Midtown Manhattan. Everything really, really prime, overpaying. And the buildings were completely empty because they were trying to develop them.
In retrospect, it was a great time for me to start, right? It was to start on that day when everyone else was getting out of the business, when markets were crumbling, because the CEO of our company sat like basically right there in our office on 49th Street. And he looked at me and said, okay, well, I need new people. So I'm gonna work with him because he's not gonna leave because he doesn't know anything else. And so I just hustled and worked, and I just thought those first 2 years of my career where I just thought real estate was the hardest thing in the world, and I thought everybody was losing their jobs, and I just thought that's the way life was. And then slowly things got a little bit better.
For us, that meant opportunity. I knew all the buildings in the neighborhood. I knew around 34th Street in Herald Square and in Times Square. I knew all the property owners, I knew all the developers, and then I started to meet all the banks. And at that time, Lehman Brothers had a $500 million mortgage on a property in Times Square, and one, for whatever reason, through a lot of hustle, through a lot of calling, a lot of presentations, and a lot of meetings and offers, I was able to sell that Lehman loan probably at a 60% discount.
We were selling loans mostly for busted condo deals, development sites that never got off the ground. But New York, and again, talk about the resilience and how pricing began to come back. In a lot of cases, the market saved these lenders because we were getting prices for these loans. You know, everyone always asks, what's the discount? I want to pay pennies on the dollar. In some cases, we were getting these lenders everything they were owed.
And you know that through terrorist attacks, through hurricanes, through the Great Recession, New York City always bounces back. Real estate always bounces back, and people are paying more for real estate today than they were before any of those times. Everything's gonna be okay.
And for those that were fortunate enough to understand that this was a cycle, although very difficult and very painful, that they were buying prime properties for 50% off or 60% off.
And they supported also the automobile companies. Things began to turn, and particularly here in New York, we found ourselves with a set of circumstances significantly improving by 2010. And then by 2011, much, much better. And by 2012, you could see we're in a major recovery.
You saw that the market started getting better, and it got a lot better. And one thing that I have seen time and time again throughout my career is do not bet against New York. It always comes back because it is the safety deposit box of the world.
The state of our union is getting stronger, and we've come too far to turn back now. As long as I'm president, I will work with anyone in this chamber to build on this momentum. But I intend to fight obstruction with action, and I will oppose any effort to return to the very same policies that brought on this economic crisis in the first place.
Resilience means to me, I think like nonstop hustle, right? When I think resilient, I think of like, I don't know, a horse or a dog with like a broken leg who still runs to finish the race, no matter what. Like that's a resilient, like beast, and we have to be the same way.
And I think resilience is here, and on the other end of the spectrum is entitlement. And entitlement will get people nowhere but into trouble and non-performance and disappointment. Resilience, on the other hand, can bring amazing things. But what resiliency means to me is that it's not a cakewalk. It's born of toiling. It requires grit. And it's in all of us. It's just a question of how hard we're willing to work and how much we believe in ourselves. And that's resiliency. And that's why I think, in some ways, it's a Rorschach for who's a real New Yorker. And anybody who's a real New Yorker is chock full of resilience. I believe it.